Now that the Hartland Historical Society business meeting is complete, I would like to have Peter Stred, a resident of Hartland and a friend to our guest speaker, come up and introduce Walt Woodward, who will be presenting Leaving Connecticut, Shaping America.
Good afternoon, everyone. Now, when I was asked to introduce Walt, it made me very, very happy because he is a friend of mine, and it's always a pleasure to introduce your friends. But also I thought, wow, there's so much to say about him because he's really an interesting person. And then I was told, do it on the less is more method. So I'm going to give you my less is more introduction of Walt by not telling you a lot about him. For instance, I won't tell you that he's the fifth state historian. And I won't tell you that he's a scholar in early American history and Atlantic history, and with a concentration in Connecticut. And I won't tell you that he has a variety of interests, from alchemy to early music, or that he traveled from Cleveland to Connecticut on a regular basis when he earned his PhD, a very difficult task, and was granted a PhD with distinction from UConn in 2001. And I won't tell you about the thousands, maybe I exaggerate, the millions of teachers that he's helped through the years, making them better teachers and making them artists instead of just craftsmen. And I'm certainly not going to mention his career before he became a historian, or tell you anything about his Grammy Awards for hit music that he's written, or his 9 Clio, 8 Clio Awards. But I will tell you this about him, that you are in for an hour of really interesting materials presented to you by one of our country's finest historical thinkers. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Walter Woodward, our Connecticut State Historian.
That's really all I wanted you to hear, so it's a great day out there. I've got to say that I have known Peter for a long time, and I had the great pleasure of working with Peter and a group of other teachers for many years, actually, kind of studying and incorporating Connecticut history into their teaching. And what I will tell you he knows I believe this because I've told him that. I think Peter is probably the finest teacher I ever had the honor of working with. The guy does things with young people to make history come alive for them that you wouldn't believe. It's absolutely amazing, and it's creative. It's a joy to watch. And I think one thing we would all really appreciate is that once a year he would take a group of students down to the Capitol and they would reenact the Battle of Bunker Hill there at the state Capitol. Who wants to storm the Capitol now, right? Anyway, Peter, thank you for that wonderful and absolutely untrue introduction. Google. What I want to do today, actually I want to ask a question before I begin. Have you guys looked out the window? What's the matter with you? You all are here instead of out there.
Yes.
I fully expected to walk in to see, Peter and maybe his wife, and that would be it. And we'd have a nice afternoon together. So thank you so much for coming out. I really appreciate it. I'm so happy that the talk I'm going to give you today ties in with your current exhibit, because this is a subject that absolutely fascinates me, and it's one that I spent a month in a car this summer going from town to town, from here to Montana, researching and back. I'll never do that again, but it was the most exciting research trip of my life. What I'm going to talk about today is leaving. The people who left Connecticut in the early 1700s went west, mostly to, I'm going to concentrate today on the Western Reserve. And I'm going to talk about how those people, in leaving here, took Connecticut with them. And, you know, the big question I'm wondering is, how did they shape America after they left? So that's my story. I don't want to keep you too long, so let's begin. Not too long ago, I spent a really uncomfortable evening reading our state's first ever economic strategic plan. A 541-page analysis of Connecticut's economy and what needs to be done to assure that we have a healthy economic future. Among the most troubling of its findings was the following. Since 2000, Connecticut has lost a higher percentage of its 25 to 34-year-old population than any other state in the Union. The plan left no doubt as to how serious a problem this loss of young adults to other places is. Connecticut, it said, is at a crossroads. The workforce is aging as talented young workers are leaving the state and population and job growth are stagnating. One of Connecticut's first priorities moving forward, the report indicated, must be creating an economic climate in which our children and grandchildren can not only afford to live in Connecticut, but will be able to prosper. As sobering as the governor's report was, we can perhaps draw some solace from the fact that this is not the first time in which Connecticut has faced a crisis over the loss of its young people to other, more hopeful places. Exactly 200 years ago, in May of 1817, Connecticut Governor Oliver Wolcott issued a remarkably similar note of concern in his gubernatorial report to the state's General Assembly. An investigation of the causes which produced the numerous emigrations of our industrious and enterprising young men is by far the most important subject which can engage our attention. Connecticut in 1817, as in 2017, was hemorrhaging its young people, the lifeblood of its future, to other more economically attractive locations. And it had been doing so for a long time. On January 1st, 1801, on the first day of the 19th century, the newly chartered Connecticut Academy of Arts and Sciences, in its first project as an organization, had sent a circular letter to each of Connecticut's 107 towns, asking them to provide detailed answers to 113 questions about their town. One of the items of interest to the Academy was emigrations from the town or society. In their responses, most towns left no doubt that outmigration had been a real problem of significant duration. The towns of Haddam and Killingsworth, for example, both reported that emigrations from this town had been very numerous. Coventry said, "There have been many emigrations from this town to the new countries, so that of late the number of inhabitants has not greatly increased." Farmington, with a population of 2,809 people in the 1800 census, reported that 147 families and 40 or more young unmarried persons of both sexes had left the town, for a total loss of 775 people, almost 25% of the town's population. Durham explained that the reason there's been no more increase in the population for many years is that individuals and families have removed almost perpetually to other places. Lebanon reported almost wistfully on the number of inhabitants it had lost. Try to follow the math on this, it's hard. Emigration for more than 30 years has been so constant, it noted, that it's judged if all who left the town who are still living, and their descendants, and the descendants of those who are dead, were to return, they would triple the number of inhabitants and make for a great Halloween. Clearly, though, Governor Wolcott's 1818 message calling out migration the most important subject which can engage our attention was addressing a real and a serious problem. Where, we might ask, were all those people go? Where did the grass look that much greener? Although they dispersed to sites both far and near, one area in particular proved a particularly powerful magnet for Connecticut expatriates. This was a part of Northeast Ohio. There you go. Stretching 120 miles west from the Pennsylvania border and from the 41st degree of latitude to 42 degrees and 2 minutes, a place many people called New Connecticut, but which was also known and is still today known as Connecticut's Western Reserve. This was the part of its original charter territory that Connecticut reserved ownership of when it ceded the remainder of its charter lands to the newly formed United States in 1786. They gave up all the unused lands in its charter except 2 pieces in return for the federal government assuming the war debt from the American Revolution. It was a trade-off. Connecticut said, we're keeping a couple of places, this one and the area next to it called the Firelands. Now, have any of you been to this part of Northeast Ohio between, say, Cleveland and Youngstown? If you ever visited or you have the occasion to, and those of you who have, I hope you'll back me up on this, you can't help but be struck by the way in which that region seems to be in town layout, naming patterns, and architecture, virtually a mirror image of Connecticut. From Clarendon, that Ohio land of steady habits, that's what they call themselves, to Hudson, Stowe, to Strongsville, the area roughly between Youngstown and Cleveland appears to be nothing less than Connecticut West. But is it? Appearances, especially in a post-colonial revival America, can be and often are deceiving. I've become curious about the degree to which the first settlers of the Western Reserve transplanted Connecticut's distinctive institutions, culture, and values to their new homeland. Why, I wonder, did those people decide to leave Connecticut? What were the push factors driving them out, and the pull factors drawing them to the Western Reserve instead of other possible places? What was the experience of removing like? Who went? How did they travel? How long and how hard was their journey? And how did the people of Connecticut who stayed feel about the emigration of so many of their children? These are questions that could, and I'm now absolutely convinced they will, in the fullness of time, become a book. But today, let me share with you part of what I found so far. What made so many people from the Nutmeg State decide to uproot themselves and their families and head west? Generally, it was the same 2 factors that have propelled much of human mobility in all times and all places: the rhyming twins of need and greed. By 1750, much of Connecticut arable land east of the Connecticut River had been farmed out. Many fields that had once been astonishingly productive were now only as good as fallow periods and limited manure could make them. In addition, everywhere one looked, they saw confirmation that New England's lifestyle had had wonderful effects on old English bodies. Not only had the descendants of the first Puritan comers lived long and healthful lives, those people had obeyed that biblical injunction to be fruitful and multiply with relish. English immigrants who settled in Connecticut lived twice as long as those who went to Virginia. They lived a decade longer than those they left behind in England. Infant mortality rates were low, marriages early, and childbearing years long. The average family had 8 children. The result was a population explosion that left Connecticut fathers scrambling to find sufficient farmland to pass on to their many children. Between 1730 and 1760, in a manner that would have made Thomas Malthus smile, Connecticut's population more than tripled, from 38,000 in 1730 to 70,000 in 1749, to over 130,000 by 1760, and on the eve of the American Revolution in 1774, it was close to 200,000. Town populations began to outstrip agricultural capacity. The abundant 150 acres of land granted to the average first settler back in the 1600s was soon whittled down by partible inheritance, dividing up things and sharing them equally among your descendants, to just enough land to get by, and then not even that. In the 1730s, the demand for more land was satisfied by the sale of 300,000 acres in the northwest Connecticut hills. But by 1750, the last of the colony's public lands were gone. Meanwhile, here in the land of steady habits, no habit was steadier than regularly producing children. So the need for additional farmland for rising generations became a Connecticut constant. For a time, this need was partially met, or at least was intended to be met, by the sale of lands claimed by the newly formed Susquehanna Land Company along the fertile valleys of the Susquehanna River within the bounds of Connecticut's 1662 charter, a huge area the developers creatively called Westmore Land. The problem was that this land claimed by Connecticut was also claimed by Pennsylvania, as you can see where it's located. This led to a generation of intercolonial conflict, sometimes violent. Right in the middle of the American Revolution, Connecticut settlers and Pennsylvania settlers went to war over this area of Pennsylvania. It's the valley between Wilkes-Barre and Scranton, Pennsylvania. If you ever drive through there on 81 going south, look down the mountain and you will see the battlefield of the war within the war. It's an amazing story, largely forgotten. Land-hungry Connecticutans, the conflict over that land was ultimately decided in favor of the Keystone States, so the Westmore land became no more land. Land-hungry Connecticutans, especially those who'd served in the expeditions against Canada during the French and Indian War, also were attracted to the northern Connecticut River Valley. Up the valley, these land-hungry migrants came, bringing their families, possessions, and Connecticut town names with them. They came up the valley, and when they got there, they formed Wyndham, Windsor, Orange, and Essex counties, among others. They created anew Guilford, Pomfret, Hartford, Wallingford, Brookfield, Norwich, Middlebury, Salisbury, Goshen, Bethel, and the names and the list goes on and on. The desire to carry old Connecticut to new lands was so strong that 25 of the 211 town names appearing in America's first census, about 1 of every 8 Vermont towns, was named after a Connecticut town of origin. So many Connecticutans moved north into this previously unsettled region in the years immediately after the French and Indian War, that when the inhabitants assembled to declare themselves on January 15th, January 15th, 1777, to be a free and independent jurisdiction or state, they declared that they were forever hereafter to be called, known, and distinguished by the name of New Connecticut, alias Vermont. For most migrants, Vermont soon proved to be too hilly, too rocky, and too cold. And it took about one winter. And in the years after the American Revolution, many looked to lands in western New York State, promoted by speculators such as Oliver Phelps, who in 1787 contracted to buy over 6 million acres in Genesee County, New York, for resale to New England outmigrants from his land office in Suffield. These lands were indeed attractive, and they drew many, many Connecticutans west. But by far the biggest plum for land speculators, would-be settlers, and the people of Connecticut collectively were the 5,000 square miles of territory included in the Western Reserve. Adventuring in lands and procuring inhabitants to settle them was then, as the Connecticut diplomat and profiteer Silas Deane noted, the best branch of business in America. And the agreement Connecticut made with the United States carving out the Western Reserve from the rest of the Northwest Territory prompted a decade-long debate. This was in 1785. It prompted a decade-long debate over how the reserve land should be sold, who should sell it, and what should be done with the proceeds. The debate just kind of stumbled along, sort of like the budget negotiations are doing. No doubt in part because during that decade, the Ohio country was the scene of many of the most deadly battles between Indians and whites in American history. It was in this period and in Ohio that Native Americans inflicted the worst defeat ever suffered by the American Army in a battle in Ohio that no one ever talks about. Happened in 1791. But that crushing defeat brought immediate and unremitting vengeance. Mad Anthony Wayne's decisive victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers near present-day Toledo in 1794, followed by the Treaty of Greenville the following year, effectively cleared the Western Reserve for white settlement. Simultaneously, the Jay Treaty with England meant the British, too, would get out of the Northwest, something they'd promised to do at the end of the Revolution, but finally were sort of coerced into agreeing to. Not surprisingly, agreement on how now to sell the Western Reserve land, now that you actually could settle in it, it was reached the very same year. The reserve was sold in the fall of 1795 for $1,200,000 in notes. No cash changed hands. It's just they gave the land away to a group of investors, and they were going to pay for it with future proceeds from the sale. It was sold to the Connecticut Land Company, a syndicate of venture capitalists whose names read to some extent like a who's who of Connecticut's venerable standing order. Edwards, Bowles, Griswold, Root, Stoddard, Holbrook, Lyman, Morgan, families whose members had been part of the ruling oligarchy of Connecticut for generations, were thoroughly salted among the names of the newly wealthy. The biggest investor was, not surprisingly, Oliver Phelps of Suffield, already heavily invested in the Genesee country of New York, who signed on for $168,000 of the debt. The smallest investor, Sylvanus Griswold, put himself on the hook for only 1/100th of that amount. A 50-person surveying team led by Moses Cleveland of Canterbury was sent out the following spring, and in 1796 and 1797, the Western Reserve was mapped, staked, and made ready for sale. The surveying method Cleveland's party used both copied and departed from that used by the surveyors of the United States Northwest Territory, from which the Western Reserve had been carved out. The grid system employed in the Northwest Territory was used, dividing up the landscape into uniform rectangular lots of equal size. Townships that were 6 miles square, subdivided into sections that were 1 mile square each. The Connecticut Land Company laid out townships that were only 5 miles square, also subdivided into sections of 1 square mile. The Connecticut land speculators, unlike the United States government, did not specifically reserve one section in each township for the support of public schools. The irony of this, of course, is that when the state of Connecticut originally sold the land, it dedicated all proceeds from the sale of the Western Reserve to support public education, but only here in Connecticut. One cannot overestimate the importance of this grid system in the history of the United States westward expansion. Laying out distant lands into packages of the same size and shape turned an irregular and unknown landscape into a standardized commodity that could be bought and sold at standardized prices, located with specificity on a map, and easily exchanged for other parcels of land of the same size and shape by people who had never actually laid eyes on any of it. The Western Reserve surveyors began in the southeast corner of the reserve, and they numbered the townships south to north in sequence until they came to Lake Erie. Each vertical strip of townships was called a range. Ranges were numbered from east to west. Thus, a prospective purchaser sitting in Lyme or Bloomfield could look at a map and see that the land he was being offered in Range 3, Section 13, was adjacent to both Lake Erie and the Ashtabula River, while Range 12, Section 6, was along the Cuyahoga River just south of the proposed town of Cleveland. The language of range and township became the lingua franca of westward expansion, and letters to and from the reserve are loaded with discussions of qualities of various places to settle, all described in reference to this grid system. If you want to know how effective and important that grid system was, get on a plane and fly to Los Angeles and look out the window. Once you get past Pennsylvania, until you get to the Rocky Mountains, and then after you cross over them, when you look down, you'll see two things. You'll see grid lines that are roads marked on the landscape that follow that north, south, east, west pattern. There's a regularity that, you know, for us folks in Connecticut, we're always driving around hills. You just can't believe it happens. And when you're out there driving it, I actually drove 42 miles on a road that never varied in North Dakota this summer. It was the strangest thing I ever did. And it feels weird when all you see is grass all around. Anyway, sorry about that. Grid system is an essential part of the American story. Now, in the Connecticut Land Company, to assure that each investor got a proportionate share of the reserve's better and lesser quality lands, the Connecticut Land Company distributed the survey land through a cumbersome lottery system, which resulted in all proprietors gaining land holdings that were scattered throughout the reserve. No one just said, I'm going to take this and this is mine. It's like you got divvied up, you got the piece you got, or the pieces you got. An unintended consequence of this mode of distribution to investors was that the subsequent sale of these randomly drawn parcels of land to settlers produced a settlement pattern in northern Ohio significantly different than the one through which Connecticut itself had been settled. Whereas the most common form of settlement in old Connecticut had been clustered settlement, at least initially, clustered settlement by congregations in new towns, which later grew and then spread out by hiving off daughter towns. Settlement in the Western Reserve was, from the beginning, to be much more individualized and broadly dispersed. Land was usually purchased not by congregations, but by individuals who chose their location based on what they could find out about specific parcels being offered and what they could afford. For many years, the cabin in the clearing, not the inviting village, was the most common sight in New Connecticut. In any event, even as the Connecticut Reserve was being made ready for sale, a kind of westward fever had gripped the East. People were on the move, and their direction was toward the setting sun. In early March of 1795, the Connecticut Journal ran a story from Albany, New York, indicating that, and note that this is early March, indicating that upwards of 1,200 slaves, loaded with women, children, and furniture, coming from the east, have passed through this city within 3 days. The current of emigration, it noted, flows incessantly through this city. 2 months later, the Norwich Packet ran a story from Whitestown, New York, which reported that land speculators are everywhere to be found, and the number of honest husbandmen who are moving westward exceed all calculation. The story estimated that 15 or 20 boats a day, filled with families moving westward, passed by old Fort Schuyler near Lake Oneida. The West, it asserted confidently, will shortly become as populous as the Connecticut High. What was it that drove so many people to leave Connecticut at the beginning of the American era? Certainly the opportunity to trade a limited parcel of worn-out land for a much larger tract of fertile land and virgin soil was primary. One astute observer in 1817, noted the similarities between the Western migrants and the Native Americans, the semi-sedentary Indian groups who had once roamed the land. Americans, he noted, partake in no small degree of the habits of their predecessors, the Aborigines, who, when they have exhausted one hunting ground, pull up stakes and confidently march off into another, 400 or 500 miles off, where game is plenty. So it is with honest brother Jonathan. When he's eaten up everything around him, and he's worked his land to the skin and bone, when his house is just on the point of tumbling about his ears, instead of taking the trouble of restoring the one or rebuilding the other, he abandons both. And packing up his movables, consisting of his wife and chubby boys in a wagon, whistles himself to the banks of the Ohio. It's a funny tone in that, isn't there? It's kind of a, what's the matter with this guy? But desire for land is, I was surprised to find out, only part of the story. One who reads the many accounts of this epic migration carefully soon finds a host of other reasons pushing migrants out of Connecticut, pushing them out, even as promoters' enthusiastic accounts drew them westward. These additional factors, which built in intensity throughout the early decades of the 19th century, undoubtedly help explain why the stream of immigrants to the Western Reserve became a literal flood after 1815. Now here's a surprise. To begin with, Connecticut in the early 19th century, boy, the parallels to today are just amazing. Connecticut faced an environmental crisis on several fronts. Our age, really concerned about global warming, has almost forgotten that early America was held in the grip of a period of intense cold known as the Little Ice Age. This severe cooling of the Earth's temperature, which lasted roughly from 1450 to 1850, had internal cycles of colder and warmer weather, and the decade from 1810 to 1820 proved to be the coldest period ever recorded in North America, and had gone through icebergs, old glacial samples, for literally thousands of years, and they say that decade was by far the coldest. Growing seasons were shortened by several weeks, and Connecticutans were required to heat their homes 8 months out of 12. To make matters worse, in 1815, for the second time in the decade, the biggest volcanic eruption ever recorded took place on Mount Tambora in the Indonesian archipelago. The 400 million tons of gas released by the volcano shrouded the earth in vapor, and it produced, in 1816, what they still call the year without a summer, all over the world. In New England, snow fell during every month of that year. Crops failed, and firewood, the victim of a major tree-felling hurricane that had blasted through New England in 1815, was in critically short supply. The climatic crisis created an economic crisis for marginal farmers, many of whom had been hanging on for years, waiting for the good crop to come in. And after 1816, many of them threw in the towel in the East and joined the hopeful heading west. Some people had political reasons. In fact, a lot of people had political reasons for leaving New England. A writer in the Worcester Spy noted that in addition to the sterility of our soil and the coldness of our climate, some people were emigrating because of the overbearing oppression of the predominant party. He was talking about the Federalists, a party who would not employ or buy of a Republican if they could possibly obtain the same of a Federalist. Has a Republican an equal chance with a Federalist in this region in commerce, at the bar, in physics, in divinity, or in any other profession whatsoever? We know they have not. Others echoed the criticism, pointing out that Connecticut's Federalist Standing Order, the elite subject to perpetual re-election, largely on the strength of their old and venerated family names, had used the bankruptcy and imprisonment laws to enrich themselves at the expense of the state's Jeffersonian Republicans. Calling the laws allowing for seizure of debtors' property weapons in the hands of your party to assist you in perpetuating your own power and to oppress political opponents. A Republican writer for the Hartford Times claimed that for many Republicans, emigration or imprisonment seems to be the only alternative. Federalist policy has driven Republicans to this dreadful situation. They must leave that party or leave this state. Hard to believe that there'd be that kind of political repression, 200 years ago. But it's definitely the case. Such criticism of Connecticut as a state whose government was so hostile to political opponents that it sent them into exile raises this whole host of interesting questions for historians. The possibility, for instance, that the Western Reserve, rather than being a place to which Connecticut's political culture was immediately transplanted, was rather its antithesis, a Republican stronghold espousing anti-Federalist political principles. That's a hypothesis I'm starting to test as I go along, and the outcome's really interesting, but not for today. Be happy. Other motivations discussed as causes of outmigration from Connecticut include religious intolerance. Connecticut forced its citizens to support the established Congregational Church until 1818. To support it means to go to it and also to pay taxes to pay for the minister's salary. So it was a big, complicated deal, but that's one issue that really got people riled up. The second one was inequitable taxation. Connecticut laws taxed farm families as much as 70% more than those who worked in other employments. So then as now, the state's tax burden was a factor driving removal. They hadn't, of course, built Disney World yet, so people went to Ohio. A shortage of land and that land exhausted. A multi-stranded environmental crisis. Political repression that spilled over into economic and social life, religious intolerance, and inequitable taxation. All of these were factors behind the thousands of individual decisions made by Connecticutans in the early 1800s to pick up stakes and head west. But who went? And how, having made the decision to go to the Western Reserve, did they get there? I have at this point in my research two images of Connecticut's outmigrants. One that's a bit too close up and another that's a bit too distant. The too close image comes from the numerous diaries, journals, and travel narratives recorded by various individuals who made the trek west and lived to publish about it. These indispensable accounts by people such as the surveyor Seth Pease, missionaries Joseph Badger and Thomas Robbins, the physician Zira Hawley, the English traveler D. Griffith, and the young woman in search of a husband, Margaret Van Horn Dwight, give us much of the indispensable detail of the journeys to and conditions in the early Western Reserve. But as good as those accounts are, and Margaret Van Horn Dwight's is just delicious. It's a great read even today. They're also one person's account, idiosyncratic records of one person's observations. The too far image I have is a collective view of the effects of migration as revealed by the historical census data records. Their focus is hazy, but it also gives us a sense of some characteristics common to the migrants as a group. The census data tells us that the population of New Connecticut, as the Western Reserve was also known, was different in significant and important ways from Old Connecticut. Not surprisingly, given the effort it took to literally begin the world anew in the wilderness, people there were much younger than back home. Old Connecticut was then, as today, a graying population. But it looks pretty good, doesn't it? I mean, and if you find the right colorist, no one else. More than 1 of every 6 people in Connecticut was 45 years or older, in a time when only 1 out of 3 people could expect to reach their 60th birthday. On the Western Reserve, the number of adults over 45 was fewer than 1 in 10. Also, unlike Old Connecticut, where women slightly outnumbered men throughout the period of migration, the Western Reserve population was skewed toward males by a ratio of 54% to 46%. Now, in politics, this statistic would be called a landslide. For a lot of men in the Western Reserve, it was called a long, cold, lonely winter. Seeing this condition, the travel writer John Mellish urged emigrating New Englanders to take a greater portion of the blooming Yankee girls along with them, and not suffer nearly 17,000 of them to pine away as old maids in their own country when it's seen they are so much wanted in this. A plea from the West. Another important but predictable finding of the census data is that while Connecticut's population was relatively stable, the Western Reserve was booming. It experienced a 236% population increase between 1810 and 1820. It'd be nice, of course, to be able to chart that growth by year, but that's not how the census works. If the census data gives us, as it does, good insights into how Connecticut's Western Reserve was taking shape demographically, the journals and diaries give us a view of what the experience of removing and resettlement was like. Each account is personal, but some observations do seem appropriate to all of them. To begin with, the journey west was both long and hard, between 500 and 650 miles, depending on the route selected and the destination. Road conditions ranged from very bad to deplorable for most of the journey. In heavy rains, roads became mud pits and streams impassable. In some wetland areas, efforts were made to ameliorate the muddiness by building corduroy roads of logs placed perpendicular to the direction of travel, which provided its own kind of hellish discomfort. Imagine 20, 30 miles a day on that. Where's the Bengay? In the barrel. The generally awful state of the heavily traveled routes may help explain why many people preferred to pull their goods westward on sleds during the winter snowpack. Remember those 12,000 sleighs going through Albany in early March? The would-be emigrant had choices of 2 possible routes to the reserve. Geographer Bill Keegan, using the accounts of several early migrants, created a map for me that shows travelers' options. A northern route went up the valley and crossed New York, went up the Mohawk Valley, and it crossed New York to Buffalo. There a choice had to be made between travel by boat along Lake Erie's southern shore, which was a real adventure for some people, or to continue to follow the rugged trail into the Western Reserve along the shore. The southern route crossed Pennsylvania along the old Forbes Trail, the Forbes Road that had been cut through Pennsylvania during the French and Indian War. It crossed the mountains into Pittsburgh, right around here, and then over into Youngstown. Neither route was a cakewalk, and neither offered particularly significant advantages over the other, either in time or distance. Although there was significant variation in the duration of individual travelers' journeys, the average seems to have been 12 to 15 miles a day. Less when crossing mountains, more when the weather was good and the terrain flat and dry. 6 weeks seems to have been the average journey, though as transportation improvements such as canals and better roads came into play near the end of the period, travel time to the reserve seems to have decreased pretty quickly near the end. And after the rails came in, it was great. A seemingly determined Zira Hawley made the journey in only 23 days in 1820. On the other hand, the Reverend Joseph Badger, who would stop and preach to a squirrel if the squirrel would listen, took over 4 months. No matter how long the journey took, it was an experience no traveler ever forgot. In addition to the not inconsiderable physical dangers of traveling bad roads, fording swelled streams and rivers, and climbing and descending the high mountain passes, migrants experience inhospitable treatment at overcrowded and often squalid inns and taverns. They slept fitfully among strangers, ate bad food with rowdy, drunken, and sometimes dangerous fellow travelers, and fought off both homesickness and fear of the unknown. Henry Leavitt Ellsworth sought to procure for himself some instruments of death prior to leaving Connecticut to protect himself from the rare but not unknown incidents of highway robbery. For many of the Connecticut migrants who'd lived their entire lives among the remarkably homogeneous and undiverse population of the Nutmeg State in the 1700s and 1800s, the journey west produced their first exposure to groups of people who were different in language, culture, and/or values than they were. And many of them found such contact truly disconcerting. Some found it offensive and frightening. Consider, for example, the prim and proper Margaret White's description of the Germans she encountered violating Connecticut's time-honored conventions for Sunday deportment at an inn in Hanover, Pennsylvania in 1810. I should not have thought it possible to pass a Sabbath in our country among such a dissolute, vicious set of wretches as we are now among. I believe at least 50 Dutchmen, that's Deutschmen or German men, have been here today to smoke, drink, swear, pitch sense, almost dance, laugh, and talk Deutsch and stare at us. They come in droves, young and old, black and white, women and children. It's dreadful to see so many people that you cannot speak to or understand. And there it is. But if the road west brought migrants significant exposure to things previously unknown, it's also clear that they were never far removed from some connection to the state from which they'd left. For all along the way, in town after little town, many of which are now all but forgotten, migrants reported encountering persons they had known in or who came from Connecticut, but who now resided in this or that way station on the slow western journey. The roads to the Western Reserve, particularly the northern routes, were studded with Connecticutans who, like themselves, had chosen to seek their fortunes in the West, just not as far west as the Western Reserve. Were these people who'd started out for the Western Reserve and found other possibilities along the way? Had they found the road west a road too far and just simply said, I'm staying here, I'm done? Perhaps time and research will tell, and my trip this summer was kind of helpful for that. But for now, all we can say of the tens of thousands of Connecticut natives who started out for New Connecticut in the early 1800s is that they found thousands of former fellow nutmeggers along the way with whom they shared the bond of common origins. How did all these migrants feel about pulling up roots and leaving their native state? Some undoubtedly felt a pioneer's excitement at facing a world that was all possibility. Others, perhaps the younger sons not in line to inherit the family farm, seethed with resentment about being forced into exile. Some, it is clear, saw having to leave Connecticut for the West as a sign of shame, a visible symbol that they were the expendable ones. How else can we explain Margaret White's comment on day 2 of her journey? The country we pass through till we are beyond New York, I need not describe to you, nor indeed could I, for I am attended by a very unpleasant, though not uncommon companion, one to whom I have bowed in subjection ever since I left you, pride. It has entirely prevented me seeing the country, lest I should be known. And so I suppose it will attend me to the mountains. Then I'm sure it will bid me adieu. Hiding inside the wagon so she wouldn't be recognized. You know, when we think about manifest destiny, that's something we never, ever think about. This is an aspect about migration that, it's unknown, and this happened to a lot of people. It complicates that view, that very positive view of, go west, young man. A lot of people probably felt like that was their only choice and didn't want to. Surely, Connecticutans left their state with mixed emotions. But how did those who stayed behind feel about their leaving? In most cases, the stay-at-home Connecticutans, at least those not involved in selling the western lands, viewed the out-migration with grave concern. One observer lamented that Connecticut's population had been kept down and attributed to the fact that migration from Connecticut must have rateably exceeded the migration from any of the other states. The effect of the 50,000 New Englanders who have for a number of years passed annually over the Alleghenies led another writer to bemoan the severe decline of New England's political clout in America in favor of those new states. Other Connecticutans saw the out-migration as producing not just a youth drain, but a serious capital outflow as well. The property that is carried out by this constant stream of migration, wrote one, cannot be much, if any, less than $1 million yearly, which waste is not prepared. Worse than the loss of capital was the out-migrants, the people who left, their potential loss of human civility. More than a few critics harken back to one of the oldest fears of New England settlers, the Puritan fear of what they called Creolean degeneracy, the likely possibility that settlers moving into a wilderness environment would lose their civilized qualities and return to a savage state of nature. The transition from civilization to savageness is much easier than from the latter to the former, warned a Hartford Current commentator. He warned of a population of millions of our own color, flesh, and blood, who lived without schools, without a ministry, without religious institutes, without the Sabbath, without Bibles, sunk and still sinking into the depths of moral abyss. Another writer, who styled himself only a Connecticut farmer, urged those thinking of leaving to reconsider before it was too late. Few, very few, I believe, of those who have sold the inheritance of their fathers to improve their fortunes in the western wilds have fully counted the cost of their undertaking. For myself, he said, I love my native state. I reverence her laws, her religion, her morals, and her habits, and I would not exchange them for the mines of Peru. Well, I love my state too. And like the man who called himself Connecticut Farmer in 1818, I lament the loss of our state's young people today, just as he lamented those thousands on the road in the early 1800s. How many of you have children or grandchildren who have moved away from Connecticut? Yeah, it's a long way to go see the grandkids, darn it. Don't like it. I feel a bit badly as well about leaving all those out-migrants, and you as the audience for this talk, mostly in transit to the Western Reserve. Because like you, I still have many questions about what happened to these people when they got to Ohio. But I will tell you that on this trip west, following a handful of letters, the stories of 20 people who had left. I had enough to say, if I go where they went to, I'll find something interesting. It was one of the most amazing trips of my life. From Galesburg, Illinois, to the Little Bighorn battlefield. I found stories to Helena, Montana, stories of Connecticutans moving west that I will never forget, and to tell us fabulous stories, not just about what happens when people leave this state, what they take with them, but how this state shaped America, even as America shaped them. So that's a story for another time and a longer book. But I hope you might ask me back someday so I can tell you the rest of what I found out, because this is just the introduction. The rest is really an interesting story. Thank you so much. There is something wrong with you. I'd be happy to answer questions if you have any. I've told you everything I know. From here on out, I make it up, but it could be fun. Yes?
You asked how many people had children that moved out. How many have children that moved back?
That's a great question. How many of you have children who have come back after they moved away? Yes? One. Two.
With 4 kids.
I would say it's still weighted heavily on the out-migration side. But how much did you promise them? There you go. Do we have a question? Young man, did I see you raise your hand?
What color is your house?
What color is my house? What an interesting question. My house, I'll tell you a little story about my house. When I was a little boy, I lived in Germany. My father was an American, he was over there. I was born across the Atlantic Ocean. My father worked for the State Department, but every summer we would come back to my grandfather's place in Connecticut, in this little town called Columbia, and he had 3 cottages by a lake. So when I was your age, I thought America was 3 cottages by a lake and a fire we'd sit around every night and tell stories about. What they would do when they were telling these stories is they would talk about this house that was up on a hill at the kind of the end of the town that my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather had built in 1760. And we'd drive by it sometimes, and I'd look at it. It wasn't in the family anymore, but it had been for a couple hundred years. I'd drive by it sometimes, and I'd say, one day I'm going to own that house. I was your age, right? I thought you could buy it with, jelly beans. Well, it took me 65 years, but a few years ago, I got that house. It was up for sale. So now I live in it. It's a little house. It's an old Connecticut country house on a hill, built in the 1700s. So let's ask other people, what color do you think it is?
White.
It's white. And it's got black shutters. Why did you ask?
I'm just curious.
That's correct. That was a wonderful question. Now, if you ask me what color the door is, I'm going to talk to you for 3 hours. What's your name?
Salim.
Colleen?
Salim.
Salim, beautiful name. Do you know this guy next to you?
Yeah. It's my grandfather.
Oh. He's a pretty good grandpa, isn't he? Yeah. Yeah, I like him too. He's my friend. Anything else? Well, the sun's still out, Go to the back table, eat something, talk, and then get out there and enjoy this. Winter is a-coming. Thank you very much.